I'm Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. President Donald Trump is scheduled to meet on March 19th with Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro in a trip that the Bolsonaro government is pitching as an opportunity for him to recreate his image after 2.5 months of one scandal after the next that has all but destroyed his perception as an honest and strong leader in Brazil. Unfortunately for Bolsonaro, the trip is being conducted under extraordinarily dramatic and incriminating circumstances and is almost certain to achieve, therefore, the exact opposite effect. And the facts around this trip are vital for the Western media, and especially the American press covering the White House, to understand so that they can report properly and question Bolsonaro during his trip to the White House about the realities of his presidency rather than the branding and perception that the Brazilian government is trying to sell around the world. The key fact central to the Bolsonaro presidency after just 2.5 months is that there have been more connections between the Bolsonaro family and the leaders of Brazil's paramilitary gangs and militias than the creators of The Sopranos were able to manufacture for Tony Soprano over 7 full seasons of that series. It's almost impossible to keep track of how many high-level connections, personal connections, Prime President Jair Bolsonaro and his 3 sons, all of whom occupy public office, have had revealed to have long-standing ties to Brazil's leading militia members. Just this week, a major event took place that illustrated how deep these ties go in a very disturbing and dark way. Last year on March 14th, the world was shocked when City Councilwoman Marielle Franco, the black lesbian from the favelas of Rio de Janeiro who was elected to Rio de Janeiro City Council, was assassinated, executed on the streets of Rio de Janeiro at 9 o'clock by an incredibly professional hit job. And it was known almost immediately by the police that the militias were responsible for this murder. And it's important to understand what these militias are. Militias in Brazil are generally composed of police officers, current police officers, former police officers, and current and former members of the military who are highly trained in things like snipers, guns, and all kinds of military operations. Finally, just 2 days short of the 1-year anniversary of Marielle's assassination, the police announced that they had found and arrested 2 of the people who were in the car that shot Marielle. Unsurprisingly, both members of the Rio de Janeiro military police, one a current and active member, another a former and retired member. Immediately after the police announced the apprehension of 2 of Marielle's assassins, one of whom drove the car, the other one of whom actually shot the 4 bullets that went into her head, and 3 of the bullets that went into the back of her driver, killing him, multiple links to the Bolsonaro family emerged. To begin with, the shooter himself, despite living on what should be a very modest and low police officer pension salary, lived in the same neighborhood as President Bolsonaro lived in Rio de Janeiro before moving to Brasilia to become president. They were literally neighbors. The neighborhood in which both President Bolsonaro, who has served only in Congress for 28 years and therefore has been on a public salary, and Marielle's assassin, who is merely a police officer earning a low salary, is an extremely rich neighborhood where houses are valued at least $1 million US. In fact, the house in which the assassin lived was a sprawling mansion, very close to where President Bolsonaro himself lived. Shortly thereafter, a picture emerged that had been posted to the social media account of the killer, of himself standing with President Bolsonaro. Beyond that, it was then confirmed by the Rio police that arrested the 2 assassins that President Bolsonaro's youngest son was dating the daughter of Marielle's killer, the current police officer who actually pulled the trigger. All of these could be dismissed away as coincidences, nothing dispositively incriminating. although they're pretty big coincidences. Rio de Janeiro is a huge city of 12 million people, very sprawling, of enormous geographic size. It's highly improbable that Marielle's murderer would live in very close proximity to Jair Bolsonaro, but that's what happened. But you could dismiss that all the way as coincidences. Coincidences happen. And these are certainly not dispositive facts showing at all the involvement of Bolsonaro, obviously, in Marielle's murder. But when you put them in context to all of the other proven links, direct personal links between the Bolsonaro family on the one hand and the country's most murderous and violent militia leaders on the other, the picture begins to become much darker and grimmer and more disturbing. The first and most shocking piece of evidence linking the Bolsonaros to the leaders of Brazil's militias happened in January of 2019, which was part of a video report that we at The Intercept published as part of a report on a financial scandal that ultimately revealed these connections. And I want to zero in on what these links were because they're remarkable and stunning. In January, as part of the investigation into Marielle's assassination, the police in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, apprehended 5 of the top 6 leaders of one of Rio's worst and most violent militias, the one that was suspected to have carried out not just the assassination of Marielle, but multiple other political officials, leading financial people, and members of rival factions. They're experts at killing people and leaving no traces. 5 of the 6 people were arrested. The one that got away was the leader of the militia. His name is Adriano de Noriega. And what's most remarkable about that is that he's now a fugitive, is that immediately when the police revealed the top 6 members of this militia, it turned out that the mother and the wife of Adriano, the leader of this militia, has spent the last 10 years, the last decade, on the government payroll. Why? Because they were both employed in the cabinet of Flavio Bolsonaro during the 10 years that he served in the Rio state legislature. Just think about that. Flavio Bolsonaro, the son of Brazil's president, now himself a federal senator, had for a full decade on his payroll the mother and the wife of the chief of Rio's most dangerous militia, the one that is the suspect in the assassination of Marielle Franco. The financial scandal of Flavio involved the movement of huge amounts of money, not only into the account of Flavio Bolsonaro, but also into the account of the wife of Jair Bolsonaro. And all of this was engineered by somebody named Fabricio Queiroz, who served as Flavio's personal driver for the last 10 years. And Queiroz himself has the exact profile of a militia member, a former member of the police, who somehow has access to amounts of money vastly greater than what his pension as an ex-police officer or his salary as Flavio's driver suggests that he ought to have. And it was Queiroz who engineered the employment of the mother and wife of the militia leader in Flavio's cabinet. And when it came time for the police to investigate Queiroz and to ask him what this movement of money was all about, how he got all of this money deposited into Flavio Bolsonaro's account and the wife of Jair Bolsonaro's, he went into hiding in the exact neighborhood in Rio de Janeiro, Rio das Pedras, that is ruled and commanded by this militia. Beyond all of those links between Flavio Bolsonaro and militias, Flavio, during the time that he was a state legislator, formally praised and gave awards to 2 of the leading members of the militia that the police just ended up destroying by arresting its top leadership. Not only including the number 2 person who was arrested, but also the militia chief who is now a fugitive and whose mother and wife was employed in Flavio Bolsonaro's cabinet. He bestowed on militia leaders official praise and awards given out by the city. Fabricio Queiroz, the driver of Flavio, the person who, as an ex-police officer, has far more money than he would have if it weren't for engaging in illegality is not just Flavio's driver, is not just the person who has been moving around huge amounts of money on behalf of Flavio, but is also a very close friend of President Bolsonaro himself. Yet another very close link between not just the Bolsonaro family, but President Jair Bolsonaro himself and the militias that are responsible for the massive epidemic of crime plaguing this country that Bolsonaro was elected based on a promise to combat. It should not be at all surprising, and wasn't actually surprising, that Jair Bolsonaro likes militias, likes paramilitary forces composed of current and ex-police officers who commit crime. How do we know that? Because Bolsonaro, on several occasions, has publicly praised those militias. In 2008, a left-wing political party here in Brazil, PSOL, conducted a 10-year-long investigation inside the state representative house of Rio de Janeiro state, led by a state representative, Marcelo Freixo, and his top aide, who was Marielle Franco. And together, this commission put into prison numerous ex-police officers and ex-members of the military and current police officers because it was revealed that they were working as members of militias. It was heroic work that subjected Freixo and Marielle to an enormous wave of death threats, to the point where Freixo had to walk around, and to this day still walks around, with armed guards driving around in an armored vehicle. And Jair Bolsonaro, in 2008, on the floor of the Brazilian Congress, where he was a member at the time, didn't praise Freixo and this commission for unearthing huge amounts of systemic criminality on the part of militias. He called Freixo a coward for walking around with armed guards and driving around in an armored vehicle, and beyond that, praised the members of the militia, saying while some of them might be criminals, most of them are simply people who are using their own guns and their own training to protect their communities and protect their neighborhood against criminality. Several years earlier, on the floor of the Brazilian Congress where Bolsonaro was serving, several members of Congress stood up and warned of the growing danger of death squads who were engaging in extrajudicial assassinations, vigilantes composed of ex-police officers murdering people who they decided deserved to be murdered. And Bolsonaro, in response, said, I think this actually sounds quite good. It sounds to me like they're engaged in a public service, and I want them to know that at least until the government can start doing its job of taking care of crime, they should consider themselves welcome in Rio de Janeiro. And they took him up on that because militias now control a vast swath of Rio de Janeiro and are responsible for the epidemic of crime that Bolsonaro won the presidency by vowing to combat. The praise for death squads and extrajudicial assassinations from the Bolsonaro family goes far beyond that. And probably the worst example was in 2011. When the judge who was heroically presiding over the criminal investigation that was conducted by the left-wing party in the State House of Rio de Janeiro and courageously sending members of the militia to prison and sentencing them to long prison terms, was murdered in front of her own house. One of the most shocking attacks on the rule of law and authority in Brazil in the history of its democracy. And while the entire political system, the entire political spectrum in Brazil expressed revulsion over her murder, clearly carried out by members of this paramilitary force, the militia, because she was sending ex-military and ex-police officers to prison, Flavio Bolsonaro, in a public statement, in a tweet actually, lamented her death in passing, but then blamed her for her own death by accusing her of, quote, the absurd and gratuitous way that she humiliated the police, and suggested that because of her misconduct, sending ex-police officers who are responsible for death squads to prison, she brought about her own death because of the enemies that she created. So if all of these personal links between the Bolsonaro family that now controls Brazil and leading members of the militia responsible for most of the crime in Brazil weren't enough, consider the following. A central plank of the Bolsonaro campaign was to provide immunity for police officers who enter the poor black areas in the favelas and kill innocent people. And that promise is now being carried out by Bolsonaro's justice minister, the highly respected Sergio Moro, who earned a worldwide reputation for fighting corruption. He's also the judge who put Lula in prison in 2018 when all polls showed that Lula would likely win the presidency, which is what enabled Bolsonaro to actually win, that his primary adversary was imprisoned. And then he took the judge who put Lula in prison and made him the justice minister. And they've now unveiled and sent to Congress what they call their anti-crime package, one of the primary features of which is to immunize the police officers who kill innocent people in the poor and largely black areas of Brazil who largely live in favelas. And what makes this so remarkable is that there has been an endless obsession on the amount of guns in these favelas in the hands of poor black drug dealers. And yet this week, as part of the arrest of Marielle and the apprehension of 2 of her assassins, the police, in just one house of one of the assassins, apprehended 117 M16 automatic rifles, the largest seizure of armaments in Brazil's history, carried out not in Brazil's favelas, but in a luxury condominium without a single shot being fired. So while the Bolsonaros constantly focus the country on the poor and largely black people in the favelas to blame them for the crime, the truly sophisticated criminals, which are the current and former members of the police forces and the military, are not only being praised and rewarded and protected by the Bolsonaros, but are developing extremely close links to them that show that at the very least, President Bolsonaro himself and his 3 sons don't just philosophically support these militias, but are intimately involved in multiple ways that we still only know the very tip of after just 2.5 months of Bolsonaro's presidency. So consider the implication. Brazil, the 5th largest country in the world, with some of the most important oil reserves on the planet, with an Amazon that is probably the single most valuable resource environmentally on the planet, is now in the hands of a family that has been proven to be linked to mafiosos, paramilitary death squads, and militias in all kinds of ways that are almost so numerous that one can't even keep track of, including the militia that has just been proven to be responsible for the brutal and horrific assassination of City Councilwoman Marielle Franco. So when President Bolsonaro visits the White House, the pitch that this is all about renewing the image of President Bolsonaro is not something the Western media and the US press should participate in propping up, but instead should use these facts to demand answers from President Bolsonaro about why it is that his own son, now a senator, employed for 10 years, the mother and the wife of the chief of Rio de Janeiro's most violent militia, of why President Bolsonaro's own neighbor, whose daughter was dating President Bolsonaro's own son, was the one who murdered Marielle Franco, of why President Bolsonaro himself has explicitly praised the militias responsible for extrajudicial assassinations and the huge epidemic of crime plaguing Brazil that Bolsonaro likes to blame poor black people in favelas for, when it's actually his friends and associates and neighbors who are responsible for it. That is the context of the Bolsonaro presidency. That is the family in whose hands this incredibly important and large country now rests. And that is the context, the key context for understanding the real meaning of President Bolsonaro's visit on March 19th to meet with President Donald Trump in the White House.